Hey, good morning, all. Wednesday, June 2nd, and on the Common Good podcast, you know that means on Wednesdays, we bring together faith leaders, and we talk about issues that are happening in our worlds and where we're all coming from. I'm Doug Padgett from Minneapolis, which is where I am now. And if you're used to watching our live stream here on the podcast, and I look like I'm squirreled away in an upstairs bedroom, hiding from the sound of a new driveway being put in, that's exactly what's happening. So if you put those pieces together and figured that out, that's what's happening here in the midst of all the rest of life. In doing a daily podcast, there's still home things that are happening. And joined as always by Stephany Spalding and Dominique Gilliard and Laura Truax. Really glad to see all of you today. I've been away for a few weeks from all of you and have missed you, and nice to be back with you.
Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to have the gang all back together. We've been tag teaming and rotating for the past couple of weeks because things are just shifting in our lives. I am Reverend Dr. Stephany Rose, happy to be here with you on our Faithful Wednesdays. Pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church out of Colorado Springs. And again, just excited about our conversations and the fact that we are able to come to you each week and have these conversations around faith and the common good. Going to turn it over to my other co-host.
Laura Truax, coming from Chicago, Illinois, pastor at LaSalle Street Church, which is a church that's been around for 137 years, which is just need to name that as we start thinking about our topic of the day. Beautiful day here in Chicago, and we are returning to church on the 13th of June. First time we'll have returned since March 13th. Wow, when we left. So anyway, welcome to everybody. Very happy to be here. And Dominique, I'll pass it to you.
Hey, everybody. Many people's spirits are feeling upbeat as the summer months start to kick in, get a little heat out there. Some of our states are starting to open up a little bit more. People are being able to go back to church like Laura just bore witness to. And so it's just it's a good time. But, the goodness of the time can't distract us from keeping our eye on the ball. And so we're going to dive into a conversation today that's critically important. And I'll kick it back over to Doug for him to launch us off.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. Hey, we're going to talk today about income and how income equality and how money basically is moved through our society. And it's an interesting topic. I don't think I've ever, as a pastor for a lot of years, I don't think I ever talked about, other than saying things are not equal and things are not fair, and there's people who are on the bottom of an economic system that rests on their backs. I would talk about the circumstance people would find themselves in, but not really as a Christian or spiritual practice. Talk about what we're supposed to do about that set of conditions, short of, hey, we need to make sure that people are not just harmed and hurt and oppressed, right? But to really talk about, and I know I'm not an economist, and on our podcast, we talk about it, with economists on every other Friday, but in this Christian spiritual spaces, there's a lot of times where we talk about the impact of our society on people. The causes of that impact is a different question, and that's some of what we want to talk about today, with a little trepidation in our circumstance that, we're not trained up and professionals in this. But that's, I think, part of the issue is, how do we as people in our society, how do we as spiritual people and Christian people, how are we called to think about and talk about issues of equality, issues of enoughness? Equality is one thing, but just basically people having enough. And how does an economy work, and what's our responsibility to one another? Most certainly charity's involved in that, right? But charity at any level is not meant to be a stand-in for sustainability or for someone providing or being provided for through an equal and just and fair system. So in a lot of ways, I think our conversation, if people read the headline today, they might have thought, like, what are these people doing talking about that? Or maybe people just kicked into the typical places where my mind goes, which is, things are not fair in our society. Some people have too much, some people have too little. That's most certainly a problem. But what do we do about it is part of our conversation today. All right. So Dominique, Stephany, Laura, how have you thought about these larger issues? Obviously, we've all thought about the situations that are unfair in our society. But how have you thought about the causes and the solutions to those larger, macro economic and macro societal issues?
So it's interesting for me, and I guess it's just typical of how I enter into these conversations from a place of reflection and just past history. And it's interesting how our intersecting identities kind of impact the way that our faith formation happens and the conversations that we do have. I don't know a faith space where income and wealth equity was not a conversation, right? So I grew up in a congregation, first of all, led by a woman in the 70s and 80s, a Black woman on the south side of Chicago in the 70s and 80s. So that in and of itself was already atypical. But her ministry began as homeless outreach. And her work was to primarily addicted homeless veterans, right, who were male, that on the south side of Chicago had been cast away and, did not necessarily have resources. And then on the flip side, for our parents, her ministry for those who weren't unhoused, addicted veterans, then it was young 20-somethings who were beginning families where she was extremely integral in making them go to college and get degrees. She had a high school education, but she was committed to everybody in our congregation, in her congregation, either having a college degree or a trade skill. And these are primarily Black people on the south side of Chicago. Her husband was a carpenter, was one of the few Black contractors in the city of Chicago, and she helped write some of the first HUD acquisitions. So she acquired properties, flipped these properties, and made sure that our parents became educated and homeowners. So like economics and income equity was always a part of like my understanding of who we are as people, as Black people, particularly in a very segregated city that did not want to share wealth and to distribute equitably wealth. So I'll just say like that's the foundation of how I enter from a faith perspective, as well as from a social economic perspective, looking at the kind of systems that disenfranchises and disables people economically.
Yeah, I would say kind of mine in some ways is similar, I think, but different. So my faith formation was very much centering the economic conversation in regards to consequences for prophetic action. And so, as I've talked about numerous times, I grew up in Metro Atlanta in the shadows of Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, and really understanding how during the movement, the main places movement activity would be housed and different things would be in the church, because it was the one place that was owned and financed by Black folk. And so it was something that people couldn't be intimidated and basically coerced not to use. And so people oftentimes ultimately ended up having to send their kids out in the street because they would be fired for participation in these kind of activist communities. So I was very attuned to the fact that what we're called to bear witness to and the kind of prophetic way in which we're commissioned into the world is a threat to the status quo. And there are economic consequences for threatening the stability of our, status quo. And so I think from that perspective, the questions of economics and faith had always been tied to me. And I, even today, as I see, my peers and different folk who are doing this work, who folk are threatening pulling funding because of, CRT and all this other stuff that, this has been an elongated history. And I think for me, I've always understood how fundamentally intertwined they were. But I say one way that I think economics has been centered for me later in my faith journey is really just asking questions about access. So particularly as I've worked in communities that are food deserts, that don't have access to healthy and quality food, just asking real questions. How can a society be structured in a way where some people have so much access and some people are like permanently excluded from an infrastructure perspective, where there's not even a way for them to have access because there's not even kind of the infrastructure to sustain access. Then I'd say the other thing, working with returning citizens and all of the economic questions that presents, particularly with individuals coming back with a felony on their record. And then lastly, I'd say, as I've done more of the multi-ethnic work, really understanding the economic questions around wage theft and some of the things that our brothers and sisters have to do as they do like migrant farm working, and some of the economic questions and questions about human dignity and integrity and all those kind of things. And really the church's role in also oftentimes acquiring those services and not paying just wages for vulnerable people who don't have a kind of union or kind of some kind of legal support system behind them, and also being complicit with economic coercion. So I think those have been the ways more recently over the last decade. I'd say my faith formation has really kind of expanded this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for me, I think I was very much a regular story of a white person in a conservative, largely white church, that if we talked about money at all, it was about how it's our money, how we are the ones who have made it. We are the ones who choose what to do with it. That classic capitalist dictum that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that capitalism has been the greatest invention in the history of humanity for raising the tide, for allowing people to have income that will put all these other things in motion, whatever those other things are. And I will say that I drank that Kool-Aid for many decades. And in fact, it wasn't until I moved from the South to Chicago and to the biggest city I've ever lived in, where I started to become aware of A, how segregated the city was, as Stephany has already expressed, and then B, how people could work their whole life and never get ahead. There's no equation out there by which you could actually get ahead. You couldn't get out of debt. You couldn't own a home. You couldn't send your kids to reasonable schools. You could do everything right. And I'm not embarrassed to say it. It's just the way it was. I was probably in my early 30s when I became aware of that. And then it became, the locus became, wow, okay, the system's not fair. But that was a quick kind of step to realize if this money isn't mine either. I mean, at the same time I became aware of an unjust system, I happened to come into LaSalle Street Church, a church I was just visiting, and Philip Yancey, the author, was happening to be given a testimony that day, and his testimony was on how you don't get a tax break on charitable giving if you give more than, I think it was 40% of your income away. And I sat there thinking, well, holy crap. I mean, how does anybody know that unless, unless you're that guy, right? Unless you're that one thinking of that. So that kind of opened me up to, first of all, a posture of generosity that I had been, up to that point, had been unknown to me. I thought if you gave your tithe, you were like good to go, right? It didn't even occur to me that was a starting, that was the bottom, that was the floor, not the ceiling, right? And then beyond that from generosity, when you start living in a place of understanding that this money is not mine to keep, it's back to Doug's comment. It's not how much can I retain, it's how simply can I live so that others can live simply at all, can simply live, right? That, you start going on those conversations and on that journey, and one thing leads to another, and you find you're in a different landscape, and you're in, and not only as an individual thinking about, wow, how are we blessed in order to bless others in that way of the Abrahamic covenant, but also how can I as an individual have an impact on these structures that are demonstratively disabling, demonstratively unfair, demonstratively unjust. So it's been a journey. And I think after you get on that journey, I think it's how wonderful to have started that as a kid. But we can start it at any time, right? So that's my little bit of background to add.
Yeah. And, what I find so interesting about this is we all, we represent this wide range. I grew up in a family that my dad was a felon before I was born. So we lived with all the implications of him not being able to buy a house and get a, federally backed loan, and jobs were difficult to come by. And I didn't know the specifics of that as a child. I just sort of lived in, we lived in an apartment complex our whole lives. I was the first person to graduate from college in my family, all of these kinds of implications. And one of the questions that sort of strikes me about our introduction to this is that it kind of sets up this question for a lot of people. Are we supposed to dig in deeper into the system? So Stephany, I think about, the pastor that you grew up with, and she was like, hey, look, folks, you're going to college. I remember when I was a youth pastor at a predominantly white church in the suburbs, third ring suburbs, wealthy place. The big question was, should your life have more meaning than simply graduating from high school and going off to a good college? Like, we were having to question for white kids from privilege, does your life have more meaning than just following the path that you're on? Right? Go to college, get a good job, make good contribution back to society. Is there something more? So there are a whole bunch of kids saying, like, maybe I should go serve in the world somewhere. Maybe I should take a year off and not go right to college. Maybe I should jump out of college altogether and live simply in a commune somewhere with a group of people, right? This was a different call of the gospel to not necessarily follow along that same path. And then other people are in situations where the question is, don't follow along the path that this society has you on, which is to live in poverty. You've got to climb out of it by going to college. And you can see how people can feel these cross currents of struggle, right? Do I plug into the system? Do I step out of the system? Do I create an alternative system? Dominique, I hear you describing that alternative system being created. And is that what we should do? Should there be, I know churches that run banks so that you're inside of another banking system. And this is what I think is curious about the American religious experience, is that whatever the gospel calls a person to, right, to righteous living, that's really conditional, on where you find yourself and what what the pressures of society are on you to conform you to that pattern. And how do you break the pattern? How do you stay with the pattern? Should you start a company and hire a bunch of people? Should you be an owner? Should you not own things? Like these questions, they broil and they roil in all of us. I now think about my own children, and now I'm in this middle generation between my parents and their life experience, how that impacted me, then the experience that I live in, and my kids who just assume that college was a thing that they should do and they should, they should pursue. But only one of our 4 children have completed college. And so you just sort of wonder about like how do we approach this complex economy and complex United States and global citizenry? How do the implications of the gospel land on us about these issues?
God, that's so big. That's so big, Doug. Right? I mean, that's a fundamental, where are you going to stand in this world kind of question that you've just asked there. Yeah.
Well, and this is why I think it's
there's so much biblical evidence to lead us to how we should be thinking about economics. From Old Testament to New, right? Like the laying of the law that required to leave enough for those who did not have, to glean from your, gardens or from your land or what have you, to have Jubilee and to right the economic disparities of what society would do, what human beings would do, to forgive debts and not have usury, right? Like that is the fundamental law or Abrahamic law that we are given. And yet, we talk about being a Christian society or rooted in Abrahamic tradition or even people of faith. And it is as if those aspects of social economic responsibility don't exist. Like it is so present throughout the Bible. I mean, even when Christ is talking to the rich man or and they are asking, what else can I do? I've lived a good life, and God, Christ is like, give it away. The ways in which we are just tied to not caring for other people, to Laura's point, so that they can simply live, not for us to be able to say, oh, how can I downsize? And Brene Brown is telling me da 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 da, but so that others can simply live on the planet,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I've had so many conversations with people, extremely wealthy people who could very easily, as many people could, right? We could live on 20% maybe of what we actually live on, or maybe even less, I don't know. But the distinction that we make between what should be voluntary in our life, Jesus asking the rich young ruler that question, but leaving it up to him to decide. That question between, is it in fact my individual choice, or is it a mandated reform that we should be about? Should we have government regulation that says, if you make $250,000, your tax rate increases? It doesn't get lower, it increases, you dimwit, right? Mm-hmm. But the conversation around that should not be a government mandate to me. That should be my individual choice. And look at all these passages in the Bible where it is, where God allows people to make that decision. It's that kernel, and I think there's answers for that. But it's that rub right there that I live in, it feels like. Those are the kinds of conversations I have a lot. And I feel like sometimes I'm in this place of just trying to cajole people to do better charity. But I don't think that's what God's ultimately after. And the fact that we don't have a political mandate in the Bible for the government to freaking do good for the poor, for the widows and the orphans, the fact that that's never mandated is simply a fact that we, after the Jews lost their kingdom, they were no longer in charge. And they never could organize themselves around governmental edicts and programs and changing the structures. And in fact, I mean, I think that's why you get to the Middle Ages, and the only jobs open to the Jewish community in throughout Europe, at least in the Middle East, was usury. It was banking. Those were the professions that Jewish folks could go into. So at one level, it's super clear. And at another level, I feel like the Bible offers us just kind of the road, the big playing field without the, the program and structure, right?
Yeah, I remember learning something about, and I've kind of lost this now, but something about in the Hebrew society, so of Hebrew scripture, that there were multiple tithes, right? So 3 or 4 tithes. Some went to the temple, some went to the poor, some went to the functioning of the system. And I heard someone, this felt right to me, at least when I heard it, suggest that in our day, we tend to separate out our personal monies and contributions from like our collective giving to charities or religious groups from our taxes, and then from how we spend the rest of our money and the impact that it has. And that bifurcation between the ways that we think about the economy and what we actually have control of would have been compounded differently in a period when you read especially the Hebrew scriptures. When you read that, there was something, because the society was more agrarian and more interconnected and less complex financial systems, we all sort of joked about the fact that, I'm putting in a new driveway. You guys have all moved different places just since we've started this podcast, right? Movements have been happening, that the way we use our housing as a financial instrument is a really curious way that way that our society organizes our wealth. And so I feel like for so many of us, the bulk of our monies, the majority of the money that we have, and this might not be true, Laura, the 40% tithers that you're talking about, but for most of us, we don't feel like we really have control over that system. We feel like, or at least I do, I feel like I can make the best choices in that world, but boy, the real money in my life and the real money in our society, that's under the control of other powers, other systems, other individuals. I don't know. So it feels like, boy, I'm just really working on this one little small percentage of the monies that, if I look at my own bank account, 90% of it is sort of called for basic sustenance of life, just sort of the basics, and not really something I feel like I have a lot of choice or agency around at all. But maybe that's a cop-out. I don't know.
I mean, I think all of that is true. And I appreciate this spin on the conversation. But I also am clear that like scripture is very definitive around the reality of economic exploitation and really talking about why the poor are poor. It's not just because people are lazy and don't work. Like, it speaks to some of that, like, because there's always this part of society where, there are some tenets of truth there, but there are usually, if we go there, underlying things that are actually really going on, probably unaddressed trauma or something going on that but more than that, it speaks about systemic sin and economic exploitation. It talks about weighted scales. It talks about dishonest measurements. It talks about exploitative legal systems. It talks about all these things, and God condemns it out in the world and when Israel participates in it. And so I think like there is more than, I think these are good questions that y'all are asking. And I think these are faithful questions that we need to wrestle with. But I think when we talk about the broader questions of like why the poor are poor, like one of the things that really irks me to no end in the church is when we talk about like, you know, well, people try to explain away poverty, like the poor will always have witness, so we don't need to worry about it. Or, you know, they want to talk about the poor, but we never go and ask the real questions about what the Bible has to say about why the poor are poor. And I think that's the more important question for me that I think the church needs to be really asking real questions about, like, why are the poor poor and how are we complicit in sustaining the poverty of the poor through the way in which we economically engage in the world? And so I think that has direct implications for the questions that y'all are asking, but I also think that this is another piece of the puzzle that I think we really need to press into.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Dominique, for sure. I also think that Doug's raised this interesting piece around, let's call it the commodification of our lives. And it was something, Doug, that you mentioned around, how do we participate in these systems? For instance, I mean, is it a godly call to participate in the system of economics and become a business owner and employ all these people and benefit by the system that's also oppressing? And yet here's this good thing I'm doing. And yeah, those are complicated. I think those are complicated, right? Because we're living in these systems, and it reminds me of something you had said, and this is the commodification piece, this is the link to it, about how even in this system, we used to just let friends stay in our house, sofa, surf, right? But now we could make a buck by putting that spare bedroom, if we're graced to have one, on some economic channel. We used to just loan our cars out, but now we can do a zip car and charge $50 for it. And, the system will always press against, I think, these instincts and this God instinct in us for sharing, for one anotherness, for togetherness, for open-handed living, right? There's a lot of systems you have to stand against to be faithful, it feels like.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, particularly with the church, capital C, I think it goes back to Doug's conundrum, like, what do I, little I, individual, do? And our impetus is to really see the system outside of ourselves, when the reality is the system is the function of who we are as a collective body of individuals, right? Like we are, I ask my students all the time, and they want to say, well, society oppresses and society does this. And I'm like, who the hell is society? Like,
right.
We are society. We make these decisions. We make these decisions in this particular society by those we choose to support through electoral processes and appointments, and whether or not we engage in the political process, because they then go on and make other decisions that they articulate are in favor of our ideological perspectives and leanings and things of that nature. And so even when we aren't participating, we are participating. And we're participating even as the church, again, with the capital C. And part of that, which breaks my heart as a faithful person, period, but then also as a faithful leader, is the way that Israel, the way that the church has become a part of the exploitation, the economic exploitation of beings, right? So much so that there are many churches that grab onto this piece of charity, and they highlight their charitable givings. They talk about their food pantries, like Ebenezer included, right? They talk about their food pantries and their outreach ministries or what have you, and they are so invested in the poor you will always have with you that we aren't working to dismantle economic disparity, right?
Yes.
We are
Yes.
so committed to the place of having a pantry that eliminating food insecurity would disrupt us completely. Like, there are churches that would not function. They would not know their identity if they didn't have poor people to feed, right? That's problematic,
You're right.
We are so invested in the industrial complex of poverty as the church that we aren't systemically working to end poverty.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to kind of what Laura was kind of mentioning earlier. I think all of the stuff we always talk about, they're discipleship issues. And I think at the root of this one, in a large respects, is I don't know how many Christians really believe that what we have is not ours. Like that we've actually been entrusted with something to steward and to steward for the furtherance of the kingdom and the good of our neighbor. Like it doesn't mean that we neglect ourselves, but it does mean that what we have is not just for us. And I think because most Christians don't have that worldview, I think it's going to be this perpetual kind of uphill climb to try to convince folk to live in the kind of open-handed manner that you talked about. And, and I can say this is something that's true for me, even though I think we have gotten to a place where I think we do this a lot much more intentionally. But, so for example, the house that me and my wife bought in Chicago, when we bought that house, my wife had the deep, deep conviction that house did not need to be just for us. And so we intentionally went and bought a duplex with the intention that we were going to live in the top and we were going to use the bottom exclusively for supporting returning citizens who are trying to come out of incarceration and start their lives over, and give preference to returning citizens who are moms who are trying to reunify with their children. And we intentionally bought in a good enough school district so that when they went before a judge, that the judge would consider the school that the child would be going to if they reunified with the mom. And that was part of their discernment process about reuniting families. Like, we are not rich in any way, shape, or form, but there was an intentionality behind how we entered in. And that intentionality allowed us to live in a way that bore witness to something bigger than the fact that what we had was ours. And I just don't think that we disciple folks in the pews in a way to help them to understand that, yes, you can still have enough for yourself, but the point of what you have is not just for yourself. Like, you're blessed to be a blessing. It's blessed. You're blessed for it to flow through you and to bear witness to who and whose you are through how you choose to not be conformed to the logics of this world and the patterns. And so I think it's a discipleship thing at the core about this, but I do think, it's not a simple discipleship answer. It's sort of like what you're saying, Laura. There are complexities to, like, it would be a lot easier if God just said, hey, give 50% of what you got back. And so we're like, it'd be it doesn't say that, unfortunately. So there is a lot of complexity to it, but I think at the core of it is this lack of submission to the fact that what we have is not ours. Like, we don't own it and possess it. We're entrusted with it to steward it.
I think about my early days in Christianity, and for whatever reason, maybe the people I was around, or just because if you start reading the Bible like I did, when I came from a a not religiously trained background, you just read through the Gospels, then you run into the book of Acts, and then the second chapter of Acts has this really compelling narrative for certain people, and I was one of those people who found it very compelling. And it has this narrative of, and then these people are impacted by this story of Jesus's call to live one anotherism, and so then the people sold all their possessions, gave to the poor, and joined their money together and lived in some kind of an alternative society that, for a lot of people, that Acts chapter 2 description creates this utopian view of early Christianity that seems almost unachievable, right? Like, no, people didn't give 50% or 40% or 10%. Right. They gave everything and pooled it together and created an alternative community. So I was really struck by that. And then I went to college and started learning about the Amish and about the other alternative communities, commune communities in the United States. And man, all of a sudden it's like, I think the Amish are the only people I know who've kind of still doing that, right? Like they're pooling everything together, where they're building barns for each other or whatever. Like they are not worried about like, am I going to plug into the economic system? They're going to take their own land. They're going to create their own economy, sort of top to bottom. And no way I was going to do that. And it sort of felt like this internal struggle of how do you get a little bit of this and a little, and how do you, and I'm not a fan of the in the world, but not of it language, because that's not, I mean, it's just, it's not the way the Bible talks about things, but people attribute it to the Bible all the time and give it extra power. But there's something about this like struggle for people to, for all of us to determine like, where are we in the system? And Dominique, like you, my wife and I, we bought properties for the intentional purpose of supporting other people. It was among the most devastating financial decisions of our lives. I have no business running a property management business to help incarcerated people get it. Like that's actually, it wasn't just one house. We had 5 of them, and it was we're going to dig out of that hole eventually. But you start to realize, wow, this is complicated life and complicated living. Not to know what I ought to do. I mean, it's almost like that Romans passage that Paul says, I know the things that I don't want to do and the things I do want to do, and I can't pick. I feel like there's this other struggle, which is, I know the things I want to do. I just can't figure out how you do it in this world that I live in. Like how do you move and act? Like, I'll just be blunt. We're putting in a new driveway, right? And you think we're going to spend $14,000 on a driveway, right? Yeah. Like, who does that? Until you realize, like, our driveway is failing and collapsing, and like they're down to like, I'm patching it all over the place, and there's rocks, and at some point we're gonna have to sell this house. And should you do like those kinds of like the high-minded stuff that I really love and write books about, and do sermons on? That I love to be in those spaces, but in this, like, what do I do about this house? What do I do about this driveway? What do I do about this investment? Where do I shop? Should I order stuff from Amazon because I know that delivery people, that's a major way that gig economy workers function, but is that fair? Like those questions, I think, cause a game of freeze tag in my mind. And I don't know about the rest of you, but you just feel like, I can just feel like every move has a reason why that's not the discipleship path, sort of the righteous path. So, I mean, you can probably tell that on this topic, I am all over the place in my own thinking about it. And I don't know if that's true for others. I do think, though, it's true for a lot of faith leaders that I've talked to, and we'll talk about this kind of stuff, and they'll be like, look, and this is why I don't do sermons on this, because nobody wants to hear me ramble for 25 minutes about, a little of this and a little of that. But I do think that's the reality that a lot of us live in. And then you get to your church budget, and by golly, I mean, we had conversations about cleaning our building when I was the pastor of Solomon's Porch. Do we do it ourselves? Do we hire someone? Do we hire a company? Like just a simple decision about how we're going to keep this place clean implicates all of this. And the internal freeze tag happens again. And I don't know, everyone's just like, well, no one's happy with what we're doing or not doing, and we really feel stuck. So sorry to drag us back into that. I don't know what we're going to do about this, but that's where I find myself on these issues.
I think that's the beauty, and I hope or I wish that more faith leaders would actually ramble about the stuff, right?
Yeah,
That they
right.
would
That's right.
wrestle in public and articulate the kinds of questions that you raise, because that is what others need to see happening, right? So that they will be having these questions, and that we will collectively begin to see as community, like, our impact. Yes, on one hand, does it matter if one person is recycling on the block or not, and everything is going to go in a mixed use place and end up in the same landfill or not? No. But if the whole doggone community is now wrestling with, like, why does it go this way and how does this happen or what have you, then we get to a place of better conversations to problem solve differently and hopefully reach different solutions that are more just and are more equitable. And I think that that's also why Jesus left us with more parables than directives,
Amen.
so that we could wrestle, and we could wrestle in public, and not behind closed doors, or not deal with it, so that the processing is part of the faith journey, right?
Yeah, yeah. I just really echo that. And I just want to also offer up this story of our own faith community. When we had made a small investment with 4 other churches in a multi-income, multiracial building construction project that was right across the street from our church building. And it started in 1970. And there were lots of great restrictions on that property. It took a bit to get it off the ground. So 79 it gets built and moved into in 1980. And for 35 years, there were all sorts of government restrictions. It was the first private, public, ecclesial housing project in the country. And but the original investor wanted out. And so the churches said okay to that. And a new building was being put in its place. And in the wake of that sale, each church got close to $1.65 million, something like that. And it became really clear to me that LaSalle was called to give away that money. That was it was one of those moments, right? Like Dominique and Doug, you talk about. I mean, we're blessed in order to be a blessing. So you'd think that would have been such a joyous occasion, and it was joyous. It was joyous. But how were we going to divide up those funds? Where would they go? How would they go? It ended up being a 9-month discernment project in how to distribute those monies around the city, for the most part, a little bit around the world, but a lot around the city. And that for us was such a rich time of reflection, because of course, to talk about that big project is to talk about yourself. It is to bring out the conversation about how you think about money and your fears around money, and the fear that you're never going to have enough, and that desire to try to hold on, and what does it mean to practice a kingdom ethic? As one person on our board said when I raised the idea that we need to give this away, she said, "Wait a minute, we're the church. We take money. We don't give it out."
Classic.
But what a great blessing! What a great blessing to be able to do that, right? And it reminded me, my big takeaway throughout that whole thing was, every day we have been blessed with so many gifts. The gifts of our time, the gifts of our attention, the gifts of resources, for sure, money, for sure, but it's all those other things. It's the gift to just act dignified to other people. Give them, approach them with the dignity that they have inherently on them. There's just so many ways of living in this posture of blessed to be a blessing, right? So many ways of living that out, that it just feels like you start taking on that identity, and it's just going to keep on going. It's going to be not only your gift of time and attention, it's of course going to be your gifts of money and resources and talents and treasures, and it's your house is going to become, the next commune. It's just going to happen because you're on that way. You're following in that Jesus way. And I don't know, I feel like we don't talk about it enough, and because we don't talk about it enough and we don't live it out enough, people don't see the winning nature of it. It's infectious. It's delightful. It's a joy-filled way of living. It's not a pain in the ass. Jesus wasn't inviting the rich young ruler to live this life of awfulness. He was inviting him to live this adventure that could have been so great for him, right? Yeah. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox. Sorry.
And for me, one of the ways that's been really helpful thinking about these things, and I might be unique in this, is just, the sacraments of communion and baptism have just been two things that have been really informative for me about how I think about my interconnection to my neighbor. And particularly in this question of economics and economic access, and the communion table implores me to ask questions about who's at the table, who has access to the table, who's excluded from the table, who, when we move out of communion, who makes what I have on my table possible to have on my table, and what does it mean that I buy things that people make it available for my table who don't even have access to have that on their table. And I think particularly when we were at the beginning of the pandemic and everybody was still having to go out as front-facing workers, and everybody else was shelter in place, and we were dependent upon the meat, the fruits, the vegetables for folk who were not deemed as worthy, who were not seen with the same kind of level of importance as other people like I were able to work from home and actually shelter and protect myself from the virus. And I was dependent upon their labor, who were going out there and making themselves vulnerable and prone and susceptible to catching it. And I think communion has to make us ask questions about that.
Yes.
What does God's justice have to say about a society that's ordered in that manner? And how do I either participate or try to disrupt such a society in the name of what I'm called to bear witness to in the world? And so I think our commission to make God's name known and love shown in the world should make us ask different questions around these conversations. And I think for me, communion has been a rooted reality that helps me continuously ask those questions about who's at the table, who's not at the table, who's made what I have on my table accessible for me, and what does it mean that they don't have the same access to the things that I get to feast off of and enjoy and actually build nutrition for the sustainability of my life? What does the gospel have to say about all of that?
Well, that is fantastic. See, we can ramble for an hour about important things. We are theologically trained practitioners. That's and we hope people do find this to be helpful. I really love that phrase, Stephany, to say more faith leaders need to be willing to publicly ramble about the things that are going on, because the well-crafted statements create a sense of relief for all of us, for sure. But so does the shared experience that we're walking this path and trying to find our way. Jesus' statement that I think one of us said at the beginning, from the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. There's at least three versions of that I hear churches say. There's sin, forgive us our sins as we forgive those sinned against us, forgive us our trespasses, and then forgive us our debts. I think it's really clear that in the language Jesus would have spoken, he said debts. he was talking about an economic system. He wasn't talking about a religious system of sins. He wasn't talking about an ownership property system of trespasses. I think there's reasons why those words got injected in replace of debts. For Jesus to say in a spirit of jubilee that as we think about one another, there's a releasing of debts, is one of those places where we're reminded that this has been a multiple thousands of year long process that human beings are trying to figure out in our many associations with one another about how we're going to live. And so it's great to chat about it with all of you today. Thanks for all of you being a part of this, and for all of you that listen to the podcast. We're so glad that you're willing to. I know you don't need this encouragement, but if you share it with a friend, better things happen in the world. So if you want to make the world better, I don't know, share this podcast on video or audio with a friend, make a little good happen in the world. And if you want to be in touch with any of us, you can find that in the show notes or on the social spaces wherever you're watching this. So, all right, Stephany, Dominique, Laura, any final words from any of you?
I just would lift up one of the comments that we have in the chat from Greg Wood. It says, where do we draw the line when helping neighbors, brothers, the neighbors? We allow folks to sleep on church property and help with living needs at the risk of infuriating the neighboring property owners. And, I think this is the tension that Stephany and Doug are inviting us to live into, and to say these are questions that we have to grapple with as community to try to figure out what faithfulness requires. But I think there is an undeniable call to be concerned about the humanity, the dignity, the sanctity of life of our unhoused, our most vulnerable, the least of these. And so I think that's a good tension for us to press into as community. Some great question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. Well, happy and Common Good Wednesday to all of you. And
yes.
we'll,
be blessed.
See you tomorrow and next week.
Bye.